At initial glance, Kisuke gives off the vibes of a drunk but harmless, homeless man with his beard, stubble, odd choice of clothing, and laid-back personality, but I'm sure that is exactly what he wants others to think of him. With the fan covering his face and the constant shadows given off by his signature hat, he exudes a mysterious aura. We were quick to find out that this shady man was perhaps the greatest example of a wolf in sheep's clothing. We are introduced to Kisuke as the mysterious but humble, plain old candy store owner, but he is in fact perhaps the most important character in the background. No one has helped the main character Ichigo more than Kisuke Urahara. From my last video on Aizen, you can say that he pretty much planned Bleach. That said, if it was Aizen who planned Bleach, then it was Kisuke Urahara who worked tirelessly on the field to ensure everything worked out. If Aizen was the one pulling the strings from behind the scenes, it was Urahara who was on the front lines, doing the dirty work, the hard work needed to keep things afloat. Most important of all, it was Urahara who was actively cultivating the gem of a talent that is Ichigo. You may have noticed almost every time Ichigo fell, it was Urahara who helped him back on his feet in one way or another. In most moments that Ichigo faced extreme danger, Urahara had an influence on Ichigo's survival. Turns out, him meeting Ichigo during his time of need were not chance encounters as it first seemed. Although you can say it was Aizen who led the encounter between Isshin and Misaki, it was Urahara who saved Misaki through the help of Isshin, allowing Ichigo to be born in the near future. This is a trend within Bleach, which has a problem started by the machinations of Aizen, followed by a solution resulting from Kisuke's efforts. In a way, these two work together to advance the plot of Bleach. It makes sense as to why Kisuke was one of the few who had his eyes on Ichigo for his whole life, as he was a part of the select few who knew of the potential before he was born. If you were to rewatch/reread Bleach, you'd pick up on many things in regards to Kisuke, viewing him in a different light. From early on in Bleach, you can see Kisuke watching, observing in the back to see the progress of Ichigo. The first time he meets Ichigo in the anime is to retrieve the mod soul, Cone, which was accidentally supplied by Kisuke. Next, we would see him knock Ichigo's soul out of his body, so that he can deal with the hollow in the Don Kanonji episode. While watching, he'd say,
"Just as I thought. Wonderful. But he's got his work cut out for him. Let's see how he does."
Later, Urahara and the gang would save Orihime and Chad after they unlocked their powers, and were subsequently rendered unconscious. Next, while Ichigo and Uryu were having hollow troubles, Kisuke and the crew would enter to help out, with Jinta, Ururu, and Tessai taking out the remaining hollows. As Amenos Grande would enter the battle. How kind of him to help out to ensure the safety of everyone. Surely he had the safety of everyone in mind, right? Wrong. Kisuke would stop Rukia in place with a Bakudo after she tried to help Ichigo, saying this is a battle that must be fought, and there's a method to his madness. Early on, we were shown exactly what role and objective he has. He was not the hero saving the day, but rather the masterful trainer to help Ichigo grow. But it is only after rewatching the series with that in mind that we can truly appreciate his impact. Later on, Urahara would help Ichigo leave his body to go into his Soul Reaper form to find Rukia. Again, all of this done to further help his development. When cut down by Byakuya, who was ultimately sent by Aizen, it was Urahara who saved him. Urahara would shield Ichigo from being rained down upon and bleeding to death. Urahara and Tessai helped Ichigo regain his Soul Reaper powers while introducing him to his hollow side, something they both were too familiar with. Against Byakuya, he would have stood no chance, but this was important for Ichigo to find out before he got better through Kisuke's training. Kisuke said himself he knew he would lose, and this loss would be a perfect motivation for him to train and get better. Ichigo would then go through vigorous amounts of training for 10 days under Kisuke Urahara, where he would grow considerably. Urahara would ultimately assist Ichigo in going to the Soul Society to save Rukia, who also secretly had Kisuke's Hogyuku. Kisuke knew that Ichigo stood no chance at the time against Byakuya, but by sending him over with some training, as well as his newly unlocked powers, it helped him in his cause for tempering Ichigo into an absolute weapon. In his future battles, much can be traced back to Kisuke's influence. Against Ikkaku and Renji, it was Urahara's teachings that helped him win. Here, Ikkaku would quiver in fear after hearing that Ichigo's master was a former Gotei captain, banished from the Soul Society. Against Renji, he would recall the speech that Urahara made to him to help him overcome his fear and sharpen his resolve. Kisuke would help him release a Getsuga Tensho in training, and he would do that against Renji. This would later become a signature move of Ichigo's. Against Kenpachi, it was Old Man Zangetsu and White's power which saved him, who again wouldn't have been around if it wasn't for Urahara. Against Byakuya, it was his holification powers that saved him, as well as the Bunkai training patented by Urahara, which was administered by Yoruichi. The next arc was the Arrancar arc. Ichigo faced a terrifying opponent in Dreamjow, and he would have been killed if it wasn't for a certain upside down individual. Shinji saved Ichigo, and he along with the other Visors would train him on how to use his powers. Without Kisuke, the Visors would probably be dead, killed off by the Soul Society. Later on, Ichigo was killed by Ulquiorra, and it was Orihime who saved him from it. You can argue that without the Hogiku's influence, her healing wouldn't have been possible. The next battle, he reached a new level in his hollow abilities. And again, you can relate it back to Urahara as well as Aizen. To conclude the Arrancar arc, we have the battle against Aizen. Up to this point, Aizen and Urahara planned and labored hard to ensure Ichigo's growth. But what happens when one side of the coin cannot hold its end of the bargain? When one side goes out of control? Against a bloodlusted, power-lusted Aizen, Ichigo would lose his powers. This was the most unstable form of Aizen by far, which is what made this an incredibly dangerous confrontation. But even then, when one side of this unholy partnership cannot keep their end of the bargain, it is the other side taking the right measures to ensure nothing goes wrong. That's when the other big player steps in to neutralize things. By that I am speaking of Kisuke, forever looking after his pupil and sneaking in a seal on Aizen before Ichigo could even fight him. Perhaps it was just the Hogoku, Aizen's internal longing for others to reach his level that allowed him to get sealed. It is all speculation, but regardless, it shows you how meticulous and sharp Kisuke Urahara is. At the end of the Fullbringer arc, Urahara is seen with Isshin and Rukia to help Ichigo regain his powers. Earlier on in the arc, we hear a conversation with Kisuke and Isshin, with Kisuke asking Isshin if he is sure about this, as it is his son's future. This must have been in regards to him regaining his powers and losing the ability to live a life as a normal human being. However, one thing that came to mind was that why didn't Kisuke talk to Ichigo during the Fullbringer arc? Why didn't he assist him and warn of Ginjo? Surely they must have had a relationship to at least talk about the dangers that may creep up upon him, especially if he and everyone else is in debt to Ichigo. In hindsight, it was because he wanted Ichigo to unlock his Fullbringer powers and train to use them, and in that case, Ginjo and the Fullbringers were the best ones to help. He could have been watching in the dark as usual, to ensure the progress of the specimen that is Ichigo, and only step in when needed, which is what happened. Furthermore, Kisuke's sketchy nature is what made Ichigo paranoid, and all of that is not without merit. I'll be covering more of that later on in the video. Kisuke also may have wanted Ichigo to experience the Fullbringer's perspective, letting him learn of the world himself instead of shielding him from its horrors. Otherwise, how can you expect a hero out of him if you need to shield him from all suffering? A hero must understand all sides in order to do what is right. As one with the genealogy of a Hollow, Soul Reaper, Fullbringer, and Quincy, it is important to expose him to each race, as well as the different problems each race has, in order to become a fitting hybrid of the world, a true translator for all the races' sufferings. Otherwise, he would just end up being a pawn for the Soul Reapers, if he was only exposed to them and their problems. There are many times when Kisuke would allow Ichigo to deal with battles while he'd watch. The fastest way to defeat an opponent would have been to join forces with Ichigo and attack the opponent together. However, Kisuke's objective has always been to train Ichigo. In the 1000-Year Blood War, just like old times, Kisuke would appear at Ichigo's window, but this time to arrange a trip for him to go to Wako Mundo to battle the Quincy's. Later on, Ichigo would engage in a battle against Kyoge, and Kisuke would sit by and watch. He accompanied Ichigo in the battle with Aizen. But why is he just watching them fight this time around? Surely he isn't afraid, especially after battling a monster like Aizen. Kisuke would remain hidden, observing the battle until he gets a call from Akon, who states they are in trouble. From there, Kisuke is seen shooting a hole in Kyoge and opening up a Gargantua for Ichigo to go into the Soul Society. Kisuke thanks Ichigo, telling him that the enemy's spirit particles became unbalanced and he was able to land a decisive blow. All the while, he has a mysterious look on his face, with the shadows of his hat covering his eyes. Maybe he was telling the truth, as he would later explain that Kyoge switched Blue Vein to Artery, but I believe he could have disposed of Kyoge earlier than that. He just wanted to observe Ichigo battle, give him more experience for the terrifying threat he was about to face. Ichigo would also unlock his Blue Vein against Yhwach, to which Yhwach remarked that he shouldn't have sent Kyoge after him for that reason, so perhaps this is another coincidence in which Kisuke may have had a part of, although it is hard to believe such a thing as coincidence is possible with Kisuke, who may have known all of this and opted to extend the battle with Kyoge if he could. That said, Ichigo was sent to unlock his Blue abilities after breaking through Kyoge's jail, so maybe not, who knows. All that said, could it be possible that whenever Urahara is shown with the shadows covering his face, his eyes hidden, that he is in fact lying, or rather scheming with ulterior motives somehow? I think it could be possible, if not all the time, most of the times at least. For example, when Urahara explained of the ways to save Masaki, it wouldn't be out of the question that he himself wanted to go through with the scenario where a full hybrid was made. Perhaps he had a way to save her, but opted only to tell of the ways in which will lead to a full hybrid, just to open a door and see what is possible, as Kisuke often says. To continue on, when Uryu betrayed Ichigo and went on to the Soul King's palace alongside Yhwach and Jugrum, Ichigo and the gang decided to go after Uryu. It was around that time when Urahara conveniently showed up, not before when they were in potential danger, but after to book a ticket to the royal palace, as he would say. Again, he was the one making things happen, guiding Ichigo to the next challenge, and even recruiting familiar faces in Nell, as well as former enemies like Grimmjow, Yukio, and Riruka. I won't go through everything Kisuke did in the series, as I'm sure you get the point. You can undoubtedly trace Urahara's work in almost all of Ichigo's triumphs. With all that, you would think Kisuke was a main character, but in fact he wasn't. He worked in the shadows to coordinate most of Bleach, and he doesn't get enough credit for it. That brings into question that maybe he was preparing Ichigo for an even greater threat, perhaps in hell. Truth is, in relation to Ichigo's potential, Urahara wouldn't have been as successful without Aizen, and vice versa. While Aizen set the pieces in play as the orchestrator, Urahara was the conductor, playing them to the best of his ability. A good analogy to Kisuke is that of a master Pokemon trainer who had acquired a legendary Pokemon that had all types. This Pokemon has incredible potential, but it will take loads of training to bring it out. That is what Urahara effectively did throughout the Bleach series, training this rare Pokemon, exposing it to the right stimuli, the right opponents, so that he can eventually become stronger and evolve into something greater. In short, Kisuke is the Storm Caller, the one who summons the rain and helps others navigate it. He simulated the rain and watched from the shadows, always available with his umbrella, because he understands the growth that comes from it, as well as the dangers of too much rain. He is the one who tasked himself in Ichigo's growth as his mentor. He didn't wait for Ichigo to come to him, rather, in Kisuke fashion, he left him with no choice. Throughout the journey, there were plenty of times he could butt in to save Ichigo's ass, countless occasions, but no, he'd emphasize in letting Ichigo fend for himself and gain as much experience as he could on his own before interfering. Kisuke isn't the hero of this story. He isn't the prized experiment, the newly budding nuclear weapon that is ascending at astronomical rates. That role is reserved for Ichigo Kurosaki. But even then, Ichigo has the most capable man observing him from the shadows to ensure everything works out.